what I'm interested in. And Jack might do the same. I don't know.
Quite no interest in it.
So I would say that I think there's a lot hinted at, more than hinted at, in Kelly's way of writing, way of encouraging exploration, which still hasn't really been formulated clearly enough on a base of, a changed base of what inquiry might be about, for us to really get involved in it. And again, a number of issues have come up in Memphis at this conference to do with the powerful importance of things like storytelling and language use, and the quite remarkably important ways in which we create ourselves as we tell of what we know, and that the actual act of engaging in imagining, putting together, and formulating in language actually begins to create the possibilities of a reality that may well become livable, testable, and will create artifacts, which we tend to call facts. So that this whole business of that all forms of psychology can be seen as if they were stories told in boring, impersonal, exciting, various ways and languages is something that I feel at least interested in, and that Kelly was more than hinting at. And that this, again, for me, the issue of writing about the clouds, begin to see all approaches in psychology as various ways of creating and telling stories, for instance, means that the most, in inverted commas, rigorous scientific method is a form of storytelling, a way of getting the, putting trust or whatever in a story so you can speak to other kinds of people. And you could begin to take a different perspective on the whole issue of appropriate methods, ways of telling, and so forth. And again, just as Kelly suggested, you all become scientists, and all are scientists. We can begin to see there may be multiple ways of engaging in the construction of psychological realities. Thanks.
Okay, let me yield the floor then. My apologies for the technological difficulty.
Finally, we hope no technological glitches here, Harry Proctor.
I really hope we can get the other computer going again, because I'm preparing for this. I've been in correspondence with Ingrid, and it's lovely to meet Ingrid and Miller at the Belgrade conference last year. She sent me a lot of nice photos, some of them the same actually. There'll be some overlap. I don't think that matters. But also she said she looked on his iPad to find his favourite music, so I made a little CD of his, some appropriate of his favourite music. Hope we can get going. Could you do that? Don't need that quite yet. But if I could put the presentation on.
Right there.
See this over?
Okay, it's both ways.
Okay, so I've written a brief paper. Should I use the microphone?
Yeah, use the mic.
Miller Mair was one of the 5 or so important psychologists in the UK who promoted PCP when I first came to it in the late 60s. The others being Don Bannister, Faye Francella, Philida Salmon, and Tom Ravenette. My first real awareness of Miller's work was reading the excellent series of papers in the British Journal of Medical Psychology in 1970, based on a symposium he had organised in London 2 years earlier, papers which should be more accessible today than they are. In 1968, Don and Miller's book, The Evaluation of Personal Constructs, had appeared. It was for many years the standard textbook on repertory grid methodology, and I think responsible for the approach gaining credence not just within psychology, but beyond to other disciplines, and stimulating a large amount of research over the next couple of decades in many fields of human affairs. But Miller was already applying his radical eye within PCP itself, and was becoming impatient with the concentration on technology and methodology that grid research could generate, as opposed to understanding people's personal experiences, struggles, and predicament. The grid became for him like, quote, a great simple-minded giant, unable to string two words together. You ended with only statistical rather than linguistic connections. Of his many contributions, 3 papers stand out to me as particularly important and lasting developments. When I was training in Nottingham with David Smale, David invited his close friend Miller to come and speak, and Miller read to us his paper, Metaphors for Living, which he went on to present at the Nebraska Symposium on Motivation in 1976. It was spellbinding. Miller's scholarship really came to the fore. He'd spent a year studying in the Netherlands, and the breadth of his reading and knowledge was impressive. As well as discussing metaphor in comprehensive detail, he was developing a radical critique of the discipline of psychology itself and the narrow view of science that it was adhering to. Instead, he argued for a multi- or transdisciplinary study in which the fields of philosophy, literature, religion, poetry, and the arts would all become part of the psychologist's concern and knowledge. Rereading this paper and preparing for this presentation has made me realise just how important it was for my own development. At one point, he compares how he feels about constructs with that of metaphor. But Miller weaves his findings from the metaphor literature together with PCP, producing a much enriched perspective on construing and the nature of man. I cannot recommend highly enough this paper. It should be studied today, though written 35 years ago. Needless to say, I don't think it's necessary to have quite such a jaundiced view of constructs, and my view of constructs which combine these two sides. The following year, Miller presented his paper, The Community of Self. This idea is itself a major working metaphor, that we can personify the different construings or positions that we take up, elaborates constructive alternativism itself, and is to Miller preferable to the rather abstract notion of the construct system. In this view, constructs and viewpoints become alive, capable of talking to each other, arguing and collaborating. At a theoretical level, this view presages the dialogical and positional approaches that have since become so popular, but it is also a practical therapeutic tool that is often very useful. It encourages the client to consider the various selves or positions that they can take up, enriching their understanding and ability to communicate and transcend their dilemmas. His contribution is important in depathologizing the idea that we have several voices or people in our heads, as it were, and that these figures can have conversations with each other in resolving difficulties and decisions. Shortly, we will look at a lovely example of the application of this metaphor, which Miller applied to himself as he struggled to deal with a difficult situation. A decade later, Miller opened the first 2 issues of the International Journal of Personal Construct Psychology with 2 articles about storytelling, psychology as storytelling. This is Miller at his radical and challenging best. Not only again did he anticipate in great detail another approach subsequently to gain popularity, narrative therapy, but it offers further thoughts on how to reconfigure the very discipline of psychology itself. We cannot understand a person's experiences and difficulties without putting them in the context of the person's story. To use a useful distinction offered by the linguist de Saussure, our construing is not just synchronic, an understanding of how a situation hangs together at a single point in time, but diachronic, how events are seen as forming a pattern over periods of time, the distinction between a snapshot and a movie. This sounds very abstract, but is immediately useful. I remember so many times sitting in psychiatric case conferences, hearing details about a person's mental state, behaviour and symptoms, and the medication that would immediately be suggested to address these. I would ask, what has been happening in this person's life, and how are they anticipating events unfolding in the future? Of course, we would then begin to hear a story that put an entirely different perspective on the difficulties that are being described. But Miller goes further than this. He says that we live and inhabit our stories, and stories live and inhabit us. Miller is here elaborating a discursive and social constructionist dimension whilst maintaining a position compatible with PCP and its emphasis on experiencing an acting person. We inhabit the great stories of our culture. Before Foucault was made popular in the narrative tradition, Miller spoke about how we are shaped by our discourses. Every telling is a political act, a fight for survival, or more insidiously, a subjugating and limiting force. Psychology carries a powerful and disempowering moss to myth. In the scientific psychology which we have been offered, we've been trained out of telling stories. Psychology, he says, needs restructuring to be made into a discipline of discourse rather than as a natural or social science. He saw it as important that psychologists should be trained to tell stories. Miller put this into practice in his own department, getting therapists to tell the story of their personal encounter with their clients. A radically new and much broader psychological discipline is being articulated. In this way, he says in the chapter in the International Handbook of PCP 2003, psychology will be put back in touch with its deep roots in philosophy, religion, art, and literature. He talks here of how he hated so much of what he was taught in his psychology tutors, by his psychology tutors, even more strongly than Don Bannister had done.